Levine and Stacy VanDeveer are going to talk about climate leadership in Northeast North America. And Julie Anderson from the Union of Concerned Scientists will serve as our discussant and wrap up the discussion before throwing it open to all of you. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Alex, and we'll get started straight away.
Jeff, thank you very much. And welcome, folks. Thank you for coming. Thank you also for the organizers for inviting me. And welcome to the folks who are in cyberspace who may be listening and or watching. I wanted to note before I started that the title of this I should have changed when I was updating my slides at about 11 o'clock this morning. It should say, Notes for a Sketch of the Political Economy. It's not really, it's not quite half-baked, but not quite fully done either. An interesting feature of this particular meeting is a particular version of interpenetration. Until recently, if you went to a meeting about energy, people who were mostly interested in climate change didn't go. If you went to a meeting about climate change, people who were mostly interested in energy didn't go. There's a little bit of overlap, of course, and a few very strange birds like myself are interested in both. But I see my friend Joe Dukert is here. There's people from BP, TransCanada, PFC Energy. This interpenetration hopefully will continue. And I wanted to start my little discussion with a little bit of early chronology about what has gone on and why we found ourselves in the last couple of years in this very exciting, very nerve-wracking climate action scenario. California has demonstrated leadership in air quality and science and policy since the 50s. This is because of the very unique meteorological, topographical, and growth patterns in the LA basin. And it created something that's very important today, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. CARB is extremely strong. It's extremely strong scientifically and extremely strong politically. It has taken on and won many important environmental control battles. It's lost a few too. Fast forward to 1992, the Rio Summit, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change occurred. In the background to most things that were happening in California, when Clinton and Gore won the presidential election, there was a lot of hope, I believe, in California and elsewhere that they would actually make some progress on a lot of the things that went on in the Rio Summit and especially the Framework Convention. In the mid-90s, California went through a rather disastrous, it turned out, restructuring of the electricity industry. Some people call this deregulation. One feature of this restructuring, which I'll come back to later, is institutionalized within something that had previously existed. And this shows how bad my slides are. I should have the 1973 oil crisis in here. In 1974, after having vetoed it once, then Governor Ronald Reagan signed into the Warren-Alquist Act that created the California Energy Commission. And when I refer to the CEC, my Canadian friends have to forgive me, I'm going to be referring to the California Energy Commission. It created this commission that has a number of duties, in particular to look out for public interest issues associated with energy supply and promote energy conservation, among other things. During the electricity restructuring, the bill that then Governor Gray Davis signed it contained funding for a new research program called the Public Interest Energy Research Program. Climate change really wasn't on the agenda of the CEC at that point, but this peer program, we'll hear about in a few minutes, it emerges as a very important actor in a couple moments. The Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1997. This is probably the last time you'll hear me talk about it. In California, we have kind of forgotten about that, except for a few policy wonks, such as people at Berkeley and Stanford. Interestingly, the first state action that I know of, and the only one that I think is very significant up to this point, is the offsets requirement in Oregon. I'll come back and describe what that is in just a minute. Of course, in 2000, then the Bush and Cheney win the presidential election, and they repudiate Kyoto, and people begin to really think in California we really need to do something on our own. The California electricity crisis occurs here in 2000 and 2001. One of the things that this does is it places California's energy system into the news media nationally and internationally, and it has not really gotten out of there at all. And it definitely was something that led to the downfall of then Governor Gray Davis. Interestingly, California passed in 2002 what's called AB 1493. I've only lived in California for about 3 years, and I'm already developing the myopia, where everything about California is important and only things about California are important. And I now can decipher this sort of stuff. So pardon me if I get a little confused. This is Fran Pavley's bill. One of the interesting features of California politics is that it is fairly easy to get termed out. They have term limitations for the legislators. And so what happens is the legislators, when they want to make a significant impact and leave a legacy, they need to start right away because they're almost out the door when they start. And so as a freshman, Fran Pavley proposed this bill to control greenhouse gases from vehicles. This bill gave to the most scientifically rigorous part of the state government, the California Resources Board, the job of determining how to do so cost effectively and fairly. And they started to do that in 2002. 2003, Governor Davis was so unpopular that there began a recall election, which created very special circumstances, and a number of well-known people began to become interested, including Arnold Schwarzenegger, an immigrant, actually, to the United States, a movie actor, sometimes calls himself a businessman, bodybuilder, a person who has really made a life of action. It could be action on the stage as a bodybuilder, or action in movies, literally. And this idea of bold action as his signature feature, personally and politically, makes a difference for the story I'm about to tell. And Schwarzenegger, of course, wins that and wins it quite handily. So here's the playing field we have in 2003. First, we have this very strong state institutions run by this gentleman, Alan Lloyd, a Welshman who is a chemist, actually, a PhD chemist. And he sort of instantiates the scientific rigor in this board. We also have something called the Energy Commission and this peer program, which is contained within inside the Energy Commission. And this is Art Rosenfeld. Art Rosenfeld is a person who helped create a lot of the things that have gone on in the Energy Commission. And he is the, if you will, patron saint of energy efficiency. One of the particular features of state politics is that not everybody thinks that the idea of energy efficiency and the analysis of energy efficiency and the promotion of energy efficiency is scientifically based or scientifically enough based, especially economists. And so there's a great deal of contention between the Air Resources Board, which gets sued all the time, and the Energy Commission, which often doesn't have to live with such lawsuits. In the middle, there's people like Mike Peavy, who were appointed actually by Governor Davis to a very powerful Public Utilities Commission, who have been promoting renewable energy very greatly. There's, in California, very strong public support for environmental protection, and of course, an emerging global consensus on climate science. Some of that climate science is homegrown for us. We have a number of very well-known institutions. So this is Stephen Schneider from Stanford University, one of the best-known climatologists in the world. This is Michael Hahnemann from UC Berkeley. I've worked with him a fair amount. He's an economist and has worked on water, and in particular the impacts of climate change on the water supply in California, which could be quite dramatic. This is Dan Cayenne of the Scripps Institute. We have a governor that favors bold action and a very activist legislature, as I already mentioned. Let me explain Governor Schwarzenegger's commitment to climate policy. It's real. And it comes from this guy. His name is Terry Tamminen. Terry is a successful businessman. He actually had a pool business for a while. He raised sheep for a while. And he became a very committed environmentalist and ran for a while as an executive director one or two large Southern California environmental NGOs. And he was a personal friend of Mr. Schwarzenegger before he became governor. And when he began to think about running for governor, Arnold, apparently, this is all more or less secondhand, relied on people like Terry, his friends, for lots of advice. And at the time he was running, Pavley's bill, AB 1493, had passed. So one of the questions that the governor had to address, or Mr. Schwarzenegger did, in the race is, do you support AB 1493 or not? And Tamminen said it's quite popular, yes, you should support it, and you should make climate change policy a key part of your strategy because he, Terry Tamminen, believed in it. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, in fact, did make this commitment. And as an example, he appointed this person. This is Diane Greenwich. Diane Greenwich is the most recently appointed commissioner to the Public Utilities Commission. She's a Democrat. She was formerly the chair, or president rather, of one of the local leagues of conservation voters. So Schwarzenegger's idea of reaching across party lines, his ability to win this very funny election, led him to be really in a race with Fran Pavley. And what we have now in California is 1970. In 1970, for those of you who may recall, there was an environmental arms race, if you will. There was a race between Senator Muskie, President Nixon at the time, egged on by Ralph Nader and other people to ratchet up the rhetoric of what they would do as president if they were elected in terms of environmental quality. And you'll see in a moment we've got a plethora of such things going on now. However, Governor Schwarzenegger is also committed to energy policy, and herein lies the rub. So while he's signing a variety of things associated with environment, he's also signing this, joining 3 Western states governors to announce a big electric transmission line called the Frontier Line to bring power from Wyoming, Utah, Nevada. This could be wind power or it could be coal power, and that's a big choice. In addition, here's a recent page. This page would have looked different a couple of weeks ago. This is the California Energy Commission members. The chair is vacant. And here's a photograph of the chair, Joe Desmond. Here's Art Rosenfeld, who's the efficiency czar. He was easily confirmed by the Democratic California Assembly recently. Joe Desmond was not. Joe Desmond served a year after being appointed, and last May 7th, just before he was about to lose his office because he was not confirmed by the California legislature within the requisite 12 months, he stepped down. The governor then appointed him to a newly created position, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Resources for Energy. Joe is the guy who's interested in supplying or seeing how we could supply California with reliable coal-based electricity. That idea of reliable coal-based electricity is a term that not everyone in California would like to hear. And in fact, this is a big issue in California. The idea that California has an increasing energy demand in the future, this is electricity demand in millions of megawatt hours, from now, 2006 is its first predicted point, out into the future. And how we're going to do that while our infrastructure continues to age, and especially the old gas-fired power plants continue to run inefficiently and very expensively on very expensive natural gas, remains a problem. And Joe Desmond was working on that. He was wondering about that. So there are a couple forms of regional action that I need to tell you about. One is the West Coast Governor's Global Warming Initiative. Here's where it exists. It was originally taken between the governors of the three West Coasts. As they've changed because of elections, the initiative has stayed in place. However, this is mostly, in my opinion, a nice idea that waits for actual implementation. If I had tried to print it down here, I would have shown this website, which is maintained by the state of California. Last was updated about 18 months ago. And in fact, the only significant thing that they've done is received this set of recommendations in November of 2004, where their staff said they should take such bold action as buy more efficient state vehicles, electrify the ports and truck stops, promote renewable energy, adopt standards for consumer products as long as they're not already adopted by the federal government, and incorporate aggressive energy efficient measures into building codes, and hold a West Coast Governors Conference. Some or all of these actually have been undertaken. However, it's not clear that these are the types of steps that are needed either to achieve Kyoto or even to go beyond. What's interesting is not so well noted are these next steps. Consider comprehensive goals, adopt common standards for to reduce vehicle greenhouse gas emissions, evaluate a regional-based carbon allowance program, and expand the market for efficiency, renewable energy, and alternative fuels. These are just next steps. The other type of regional action you have to realize is going on at the same time. This is mostly dominated by the politics and the interests in developing the fossil resources in the West. So this is the Western Governors Association Clean and Diversified Energy Initiative, and boy, do they talk a lot about coal in this initiative. That's really what they're trying to figure out, is how to develop the Western states' vast coal resources to power the Southeast and California. This is the lengthy list of climate action in Washington State. They did vote recently to adopt the California vehicle standards, which I'll get to in a moment. There's a lot going on in Oregon. Like I said, there's this House Bill 3283. Basically, new power plants in Oregon must offset their emissions. This actually has some teeth. It puts some money into some real financial incentives. The way they do it is through something called the Climate Trust. You will hear in California now business people saying the Climate Trust is the wrong way to go. So you know it must be doing something if the business people say it's the wrong way. They claim to have to have avoided 1.6 million tons of CO2 emissions through 2006. These are the type of projects that they actually undertake. And what's interesting is in 2004, Oregon also released a strategy. They also voted to adopt California's greenhouse gas standards. Oops. Here's the strategy. I want to point out they have goals, strategies, actions. These actions include these interim task force to actually think about standards and regulation. Everything else is a little bit like what you've seen before. But notice this standard here, 2050. Climate stabilization limits of at least 75% below 1990. Remember that number, 75%. That's a pretty ambitious goal, far beyond what as far as I know, got into any of the Kyoto discussions. California has a vast array of competing, confusing, and conflicting often institutions and policies associated with climate change action, some of which are underway, some of which are under discussion. I've grouped them here. The Public Utility Commission is doing its own thing. The Resources Agency, which includes the Energy Commission, but also includes the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection and Department of Water Resources, they're doing a variety of things. Here's the Air Resources Board, sometimes managed by the California Environmental Protection Agency, certainly on paper. The Integrated Waste Management Board has its role. Food and Agriculture, and I will stop there, except to note this. The California Climate Action Registry, CCAR, is a voluntary-only organization designed to create protocols for measuring CO2 emission, greenhouse gas emissions from various sectors. It's a sector-by-sector approach, and encourage trades for companies that want to trade for one reason or another. This list is a list of the major California climate policy actions that are in place, including AB 1493. This is the bill to which the other states, including some in the Northeast, have said that they would like to participate. The Utility Commission is now including an adder, which I will not attempt to define, other than it changes the way that utility, really does change the way utility companies plan for resource acquisition in the future. There is now a greenhouse gas performance standard issued nicely by both the California Energy Commission and the Public Utility Commission. Basically says no coal plants, none thank you. Directly, of course, conflicting with some other people's goals. Executive Order S305, these emission reduction targets by the governor, I'll show you in a moment. There's a climate action team, there's an emission cap, the Public Utility Commission. There's one bill after another after another. Here's the governor's goals. The governor's goals include 3. Today, really only 2 are mostly discussed because this is 2010, and for most part, 2010 is sort of now. The 2020 goal is to return to 1990 levels of emissions, which is about a 25% emission reduction from the baseline, which is here. But this is the goal that people talk about even more, is the 2050 goal. 80% emission reductions below 1990. Remember 75% before? I've never understood where this 80% came from. And I think it comes from wanting to do better than Oregon, frankly. Because this is a bold goal. This really is a bold goal. This is the first official articulation of any variety by any state government entity that I know of. Not exactly a policy, but it's a goal. It's an official articulation of the type of emission pathway that is required of developed and industrialized countries that would actually be part of a global program to avoid dangerous climate change. That seems to me that our action-oriented governor has actually done something quite remarkable. The Climate Action Team then was created in the same executive order. They issued this report in March. There's actually, I could give a long story about the political economy of this particular report. I would point out, though, that they have a real marked distinction here between, first of all, there's a bunch of climate change science. All of the climate change policies and all the climate change documents in California spend a lot of time discussing the climate science, that we really know that climate change is happening, that the impacts are very severe, potentially for the state of California, in this manner and that manner and so forth. And one of the reasons for this, and this document contains a summary of this. Remember that peer program I said was created in the electricity restructuring? Around 2000, they adopted a climate change program and began to generate a considerable amount of research designed, though they didn't know it was coming at the time, exactly the sort of information that was needed here. There's also a section on emission reduction strategies, which are sector-specific, sort of regulatorily minded strategies. And then in a completely different chapter on market-based options. And it's not clear if you could do much of one or the other, but most of the implementation actually is left for others. As a footnote, it's not really a footnote, but in the interest of time, the environmental justice concerns of climate action in California are very important and have not been worked out. This is Ann Baker. Ann was a deputy secretary, I believe is the right title, of the California Environmental Protection Agency. She is largely responsible for the successful completion of the Climate Action Report. This is an example of one of the tables of the strategies. For 2010 and 2020, this agency will do this action and will get exactly 3 tons reduced. This agency will do exactly this action, 1.5 tons. It is a very sort of bureaucratic endeavor in order to find that, yes, it is indeed possible to meet the governor's ambitious goals. At the same time, you may not be able to read this. This is before the Public Utility Commission of the state of California. The Public Utility Commission is acting on its own, and it's said essentially in this document, okay, you investor-owned utilities, you're only 70% of the load, not the munis, but you will have a cap placed on you shortly. That's the threshold policy issue. Yes, you will have a cap. We will talk about implementation later, and we'll begin making this law shortly. Their conclusions, there's a big issue about whether this is constitutional and how to make it so. I'll leave it at that. There's a whole bunch of California energy policy, some of which are about will affect greenhouse gas emissions, and some of which will not. I don't really have much time to talk about them except to say that for some of these policies, they don't match at all. So here's how the state is in effect ordering and in effect goading the utility companies to procure energy. Notice that clean coal plants do not appear on here, not at all. And I will actually have to skip through these in the interest of time. However, at the same time, there are plans for many coal-fired power plants. These are all proposed or under construction power plants in the United States as of 2004, and plans to build big new power lines, transmission lines, to bring them into the West. How the utility companies are supposed to do this, given the loading order in the Energy Action Plan, is not at all clear. So, where to next? Well, we're up for a big fight in California. This plethora of bills is being litigated, as you might imagine. It's being litigated by the auto companies. It surely will be litigated by others. There's a real question about the legality of any of this or much of this state climate action. We're certainly going to see more science. We're going to see more of the climatology and the downscaling to try and understand what is happening and what might occur. The question is, are we at a tipping point? Are we at a point in which we'll actually begin to see an industrialized economy in the world, a pretty large one, begin to take significant climate policies kind of on its own, not part of the Kyoto Protocol at all, not really part of any international or even domestic trading issue? I don't know the answer to this question. I do think if we've been near a tipping point before, we're closer now than ever. And with that, I think I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Let's turn to Henrik next.
All right. All right, thank you very much. So we are basically moving, there we go, moving from the West Coast to the East Coast. And what we're seeing in the United States and Canada too, to some degree, is that a growing number of states and provinces are moving ahead and developing much more aggressive climate change policy than what is mandated by federal governments in Washington and Ottawa, in the sense that climate policy in North America, at least in Canada and the United States, are really driven from below. And in a sense, with the theme of this conference sort of being beyond Kyoto, one of the ways of exploring what is happening beyond Kyoto is to look at what's happening at state and provincial levels as basically driving climate change policy in the United States and Canada today. And this is interesting because a lot of states and provinces are large emitters. They're basically emitting as much greenhouse gases as individual European countries or larger developing countries. So if we're interested in actually bringing down greenhouse gas emissions globally, then what states and provinces do individually is important. And states and provinces, too, are actually holding a lot of policy-making competence in a range of areas which directly influence the emissions of greenhouse gases. In the areas of electricity, waste management, transportation, land use, urban planning, forestry, agriculture, and so forth and so forth. A lot of policy-making competence on these issues are at the state level rather than the federal level. So if states and provinces want to take action, there is a lot that they can do when it comes to climate change mitigation. And what Stacy and I are particularly interested in is the recent expansion of collaborations between states. So individual states have been active at least since the late 80s, early 90s. Barry Ray will talk more about that in his presentation in his paper. But what Stacy and I have been doing research for the last 2 or 3 years is collaboration between states, states coming together and say, if we collaborate in groups of 3 or 5 or more, we can achieve much more than if we're just doing this, one state at a time. And in particular, we're interested in what's happening in the northeast part of North America, in the New England states and 5 eastern Canadian provinces. So the most elaborative collaboration between states and also states and provinces are happening in the northeast North America right now. And we're going to talk a little bit about 2 projects. The New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers has a joint action plan, climate change action plan, and RGGI, which is an attempt to set up a cap-and-trade greenhouse gas trading system in the Northeast. And we'll also talk a little bit what's happening at the town and city level, and also within the civil society, and how that is driving action from below on climate change. So in 2001, the 6 New England states and the 5 Canadian provinces came together and adopted a regional climate change action plan. Now, this is not a legally binding action plan because states and provinces cannot enter into legally binding agreements. That is only federal governments in North America that can do that. But states and provinces can sign whatever kind of voluntary agreements they want to. So in that sense, the Climate Change Action Plan here in the Northeast is a voluntary plan, but all states and provinces that are participating have committed to follow its goals and the principles that sort of underpin the plan here. And it set a very specific set of greenhouse gas emission reductions for the region that all of the participating states and provinces have committed to. The first goal was to bring down to 1990 levels by 2010. That is less ambitious than the goals for both the US and Canada under the Kyoto Protocol, largely based on political realism. That in 2001, whatever was agreed to in 1997 were just not feasible. It was just not realistic. So what the states and provinces said, that the best that we can hope for by 2010 is 1990 levels. So try and make this at least a realistic goal that we can hope to achieve, rather than just a pie-in-the-sky kind of goal. Working from the 2010 goal is the second goal by 2020, which is 10% below 1990 levels by 2020. Again, very similar to what Alex talked about California here, you can see. And there is also a long-term goal that levels of greenhouse gases in this region should be brought down to levels where they do not pose a threat to the climate system. No official number was given, but in connection with that goal. But there is an official assessment report from 2001 that was issued alongside the Climate Change Action Plan that talks about a 75 to 85% reduction. So that number has been in there, and it's been there in a report that was signed off by both the governors and the premiers at the time. There's also 9 action goals for how to achieve these greenhouse gas reductions in the region, and also 34 more specific policy recommendations. We talk a little bit more about those in the paper. I won't bore you by going through all of them. But what is happening there now is that the states and the provinces are trying to take this regional goal down to the state and provincial level, and individually and collectively work towards the implementation of the regional goal. One way of doing that is adopting state and provincial level action plans, which should complement the regional action plan. It should be noted here that the states have generally been more progressive and more aggressive at developing state-level action plan that the provinces and the Canadian provinces had been. So you actually see more progress on the American side of the border than what you do on the Canadian side of the border. It seems that a lot of the Canadian provinces have taken more of a wait and see, and we're not quite sure otherwise going with this, and we really don't want to stick our necks out that far, and maybe Ottawa will do something, and all of a sudden 5 years pass by. The U.S. states have been much more aggressive and said, well, we don't think it is particularly realistic that you will have much more aggressive federal policy. So we are not going to sit around and wait till 2008. We're going to do something now, and we're going to try to push climate policy from below. Again, the theme here is they are very much seeing themselves as taking action in the absence of federal policy. They're repeatedly saying, well, if there were federal policy, we wouldn't have to do that. If there were stricter federal standards, we wouldn't have to do that. So over and over, you hear political leaders, governors, but also senators from the region and other elected officials saying, we are doing this because we're trying to set an example. We are trying to show that this can be done, and we think it's important, and we want to do it. Again, if the federal government would want to take over, fine, glorious, we're all for that. But in the absence of that, we are not going to sit around and waiting. So far, a lot of what I've been doing has been focusing on no-regret measures, i.e. measures that will both save them money, save them energy, and bring down greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking green building, energy efficiency, and those kinds of things. Often, this is referred to in North America as smart growth. My European brothers and sisters would call it sustainable development. We don't call it sustainable development in the United States. We call it smart growth, but it's basically the same thing here, right? Also working on renewable portfolio standards, of trying to increase the amount of electricity that comes from renewable resources, whether that being hydropower, solar power, or wind power, and trying to gradually increase that over time. And a lot of states have also started working on, long before, in some cases like in New Hampshire, before even there was a regional plan, trying to reduce emissions from power plants by setting caps and trying to reduce emissions from the power plants in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in New Hampshire, and so forth. And all of this is happening at the state level. All states have action plans. All 6 New England states have their own action plans. 4 of them have gone so far to officially integrate the New England Governors and Eastern Canadian Premiers' emission reduction goal. So it's now their official state policy that we should achieve these greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2010 and 2020 and the long-term goal. And they're also then trying to figure out how to do that. And I'm going to hand it over to Stacy to talk a little bit more about RGGI, which is seen as a complement to the regional action plan.
So you did that already.
I did that already.
There we are. RGGI stands for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, as many of you no doubt know. It's a proposed cap-and-trade scheme for trading of permits, emissions permits from power plants, from utilities. It was begun, as some of you may know, with the invitation of Governor Pataki from New York in 2003 to the governors from Maryland to Maine to join in a discussion. The invitation specifically asked them to join in discussions of climate action that would be based on market mechanisms and, in particular, permit trading. So the invitation was designed in that sense to focus on so-called market mechanisms and, in particular, on the trading initiative. In March of 2006, this year, 7 states signed the model. In December, the 7 states agreed to go forward in 2005, and then March in 2006, the model rule has been issued. And how this works is that a model rule is the term, right, for their sort of the standard rules of how of the states going about this in a joint fashion in a trading scheme. It establishes, for example, the aggregate cap and the emissions cap for each state, and some joint rules. As many of you know, students of American federalism, the states cannot sign, in a sense, legally binding agreements with each other. They can't enter anything that looks like a treaty. So these are jointly agreed upon guidelines that they then take back to their participant executives and legislatures to enact in the U.S. states. And this means that in some states, in a majority of the RGGI states, governors believe that they have the constitutional and legal power to simply do this by executive regulation. In a couple of the states, they will go through the legislatures. One of those is New Hampshire, where it's considered to be quite a fight. So, but at any respect, most of them will come home and write their domestic regulations. At the last minute in December, Massachusetts and Rhode Island refused to sign the ongoing agreement. Massachusetts was, in many respects, one of the 2 or 3 critical states where the staff helped design the agreement. The Governor Romney, who, as some of you know, is also running for president, Governor Romney credited business opposition and the costs of incurred by utilities for his withdrawal. That is largely. I know no one who believes that is the reason, I should say. And in fact, the governor at the last minute asked for a number of concessions for Massachusetts, so that Massachusetts can sign. The other states gave him all of the concessions, and then he refused to sign. Thereby, I think that empirically, I think the evidence suggests that Governor Romney didn't sign because he's running for president. There is an expectation in Massachusetts that Massachusetts is likely to join the endeavor after the fall elections when Governor Romney is no longer governor, and there will be a new governor. And there's some expectation that no matter who of the current 4 or 5 who are running, they all seem to be inclined toward participating. The effort, you should know, just very briefly, good, okay. Very briefly, it turns out. Done. No, the effort was largely driven by the staff working groups. One of the things that in interviews of the state civil servants and political appointees who participated, that they returned to over and over again, to echo something that Alex Farrell said, was that in their many years of service in environmental programs and in energy programs in their respective states, they say that they have never spent, the environmental agency folks say they've never spent as much time with their energy colleagues, and the energy colleagues say that they have never had as much cooperation with their environmental colleagues as they've had around this initiative, that they really have worked deeply together and moved information back and forth. And so that there's a lot of discussion of the notion that one of the learning curves experienced in the policymakers in the executive branch was precisely the need to continue this trend toward environmental and energy integration if these questions are to be addressed. The stabilization of emissions goal, so the goals. The program is hoped to start in 2009. Again, there is a long legislative and executive process between today and 2009 in all of the participating states in order to get there. But the hope is that it will start in 2009, that the 2009 to 2015 period is the stabilization period. Notice this goal then slips from the New England Governors Conference goal. The New England Governors Conference was to stabilize at 1990 levels, at 2000 levels by 2010. Now the RGGI goal is to stabilize at 2000 levels by 2015, or by a 3-year compliance period within that those 6 years. This is largely, again, bowing to reality. A number of states believe that they will not have too much trouble meeting the goal, but some of the larger states are probably going to have a tough time getting to stabilization by 2010. Also, because the RGGI initiative includes New Jersey and New York, very large states that did not participate in the New England agreement. New Jersey and New York did not feel compelled to abide by the agreement reached earlier by the New England states, and so this too was a bit of a tough negotiation. And again, the goal of 10% reduction by 2019. I could talk a little bit more about where things are with the RGGI program, and happy to talk a little bit about that, but I think we'll move on a little bit just to note the multiple levels of climate politics in the region. Since Speaker Tip O'Neill was a Massachusetts and hailed from the Commonwealth, we had to quote him in his constant use of the notion of all politics being local. 60 cities and towns have joined the Climate Protection Initiative. A number of the region's mayors signed the mayor's agreement cited earlier today. A number of the cities have fairly impressive action plans. Many of the cities do not, who have signed. It should be said. I don't want to overstate this. Interestingly, there is a lot of municipal level climate politics in the region, but there are no the most famous cities, the ones who've achieved, who are considered in the cities literature on this to have achieved a lot, are not in the region. Portland and Toronto come up a lot. New York, actually under Mayor Bloomberg, seems to be getting pretty serious as of late, so there is a lot of activity there. Boston made a whole set of commitments under Mayor Menino. I can't believe that any one of them has been met because Boston has done very little with regard to those commitments. So I don't want to overstate the municipal goals, but there is a fair bit going on. Again, there's a focus on no regrets measures, energy saving measures, building codes, a whole set of these kinds of things. And in particular, I think one of the striking things is that over and over in the city action plans and in the statements of the mayors, repeated calls toward more action at the state and federal level. There is a lot of civil society action. In particular, there are in New England and the Northeast, there is a very well integrated coalition of climate change environmental groups, in coalition with a number of non-environmental groups, from the Lung Association to health groups to a number of social justice organizations. There's a fairly wide-ranging coalition. It's allowed them to pool a lot of resources, and they grade each governor, they grade each state each year in reports that get a fair amount of news play. A whole set of university-based initiatives that we'll hear a little bit more about later. So let me skip on to the last. A few comments about the potential limits and the potential of regional action. I think that one of the things that's striking is the extent to which, in our interest in state collaboration, the extent to which technically trained staff with lots of experience in the executive branches have really driven a lot of the state activity. Barry Rabe's work calls them policy entrepreneurs, and I think that that's a right description for the ones in this region as well. Again, a very conscious effort in all of our interviews that these states see themselves as policy laboratories. They are saying, we believe that what we're learning lessons that when the federal government comes around, is the language you hit all the time, they'll be looking to us. In New England, there's a general belief that history has borne this out. Cap-and-trade schemes for sulfur and for nitrogen were born in the region, and a host of other kinds of environmental policies, a long literature on federal government uptake of environmental policy in the region, and so there's a general sense that this is important. The last couple of comments, because I'm out of time. Certainly the actual greenhouse gas emissions reductions so far in the region are modest. They seem to be measurable, but barely. But I think that you see an increasing institutionalization of the climate change concern at the local level, in the states, in the legislatures. Unlike California, the legislatures, until the last 2 years, were relatively passive in this debate in the region. The legislatures have gotten more interested as of late. I think one of the other things we notice, that, like some of the debate in California, is that in the Northeast, we have partisan competition for environmental initiatives and environmental votes, something that is not true in other parts of the country. New England has a long history of Republican environmental leaders, and there are a number there now, and it's one of the things that happens at all levels of government in that partisan competition. Thanks a lot. I'll stop there.
Okay, we turn to Julie Anderson from Union of Concerned Scientists for some comments.
Thank you. I'm Julie Anderson. I work in the D.C. office of the Union of Concerned Scientists. I wanted to just spend a few minutes giving you a sense of what we're doing, and then sort of try to tie what we've heard about California and New England in with particularly what I'm doing here at the federal level, which is somewhat different, and then open it up to comments and questions. At UCS, we do a couple of things. We try to work at the state, regional, and federal level on climate change in particular. We just went through a large strategic planning process where we came out with climate change as our #1 priority issue for the foreseeable future, and so we're putting quite a bit of capacity and resources to it. We happen to have offices in California as well as in Massachusetts, so those are the two regions that we are particularly active in as well. And that is not to say we don't work in other parts of the country, but it is our primary focus at the state and regional level. And then I'm here in our Washington, D.C. office where we do the day in and day out beating our heads against the brick wall here at the federal level. So it's always very interesting and eye-opening to hear more about what's going out there in the regions. But UCS tries to do a number of things when working on climate. We attempt to bring our hopefully credible and peer-reviewed, not only scientific product, but technical and analytical expertise to the debate. And I'll give you a few examples of that. And then we combine that with our advocacy, outreach, and communications work to sort of move the policy debate forward. In California, for example, we've been very involved and helped produce a lot of the science, the impact studies that the governor is using and that all the groups are using to move forward the various policy efforts going on out in California. We in the Northeast region, we're actually coming out with a brand new Northeast state by state impact study later this year that we hope will help move forward the debate and push forward RGGI in each of the states. But we also do more analytical work on the sectoral solutions side of it. So it's not all science. We work on, in particular, vehicles and renewables issues across the country and at the federal level. In the renewables world, we spend quite a bit of time across the country in the various states that are working on renewable portfolio standards, as well as pushing it at the federal level. And we're very active in California, for example, on all the work that they've been doing in the vehicles arena. From the analytical perspective all the way to the legal perspective, and involved in the legal debate right now over the Pavley Clean Car Initiative. So we try to pull that all together. My job as climate change campaign manager is to try to help us figure out strategically where we can help move the debate forward the best, and really get the information that's needed out there that will help our policymakers make good decisions. My personal take on what's going on here at the federal level at the moment is that we are making some progress. I think it's been a combination of a number of things, one of which has been the state and regions taking more and more action. Another has been just the onslaught of scientific studies that have been getting enormous press attention. I think that's making a difference here in Washington. And I think there's a little bit of the sense that the scientific community is, I don't think this is an overstatement, somewhat panicked about where we're headed in terms of the impacts of climate change if we don't start to act now. And I'll just, for one other thing that we are working on that's coming out hopefully soon in the next couple of months is, and we're doing an analytical piece that will hopefully set forth the target that we think the United States needs to be trying to achieve, similar to what Schwarzenegger did out in California, that we were involved with the 80% pulling out of the sky, 80% number. We're missing that at the federal level. Nobody's really talking about where do we need to be, where do we need to be headed towards, and we're sort of in the weeds about the federal policies that may get us somewhere, but we have no idea where we're going. So that's one thing that we're working on right now that will hopefully help move that part of the debate forward here at the federal level. But it feels like we're shifting a little bit, and I don't know if you all were paying any attention to the House of Representatives even this morning, but they're actually talking about climate change on the floor of the House this morning in the context of an appropriations bill that funds money for the Environmental Protection Agency. And a little bit similar to what you were hearing about what's going on in California and in the Northeast, I think there is a sense that energy policy, there is a lot more nexus now between energy policy and environmental policy. A very senior Republican staff person I was talking to a month or so ago actually said to me, I really think we're not going to have huge debates about energy policy in the years to come. We're going to have lots of debates about climate change. And so that melding, I think, is starting to happen somewhat of its own accord as we really start to look at the energy policies and their repercussions on the climate problem. Having said that, we have a long way to go, obviously. the debate on the floor of the House this morning was about a sense of the Congress resolution that the Senate passed last year that simply says, hey, climate's a big problem. We should really start to think about doing something about it. And by the way, it should probably be some sort of mandatory action. And put us off for a later day what to do about it. But that provision is being struck from the bill as it's on the floor probably right now. So obviously we still have a ways to go. But having worked on this issue from a variety of perspectives in the city for many years now, it's at least heartening to see the issue brought up. I thought a couple of thoughts came to my mind as I listened to what's going on in California and the Northeast, which are the following that I thought might be helpful for us to discuss. One is, do we need more action in other parts of the country? We have the coast, and we have the coasts that have always been somewhat more interested in environmental issues, as we've heard. If we do need more other parts of the country, how do we get there? Another question that came to my mind is, if the states are sort of the laboratories for the federal work, do we need the laboratories to actually get the emissions reductions, to actually implement these policy tools that they're talking about before we should take action at the federal level? I mean, do we need to see some of that play out before we really know what best to do at the federal level? Or, should we get going somehow, some way now, given the enormous nature of the problem and the amount of work I think most of us think is going to be needed to get to a stabilization target. And I guess the other component of whether we need to actually see reductions happen before we take federal action is, do we need to see actual emissions reductions happen without economic doom and gloom and without an economic downturn, which, as many of you I'm sure are well aware, the debate here at the federal level is often revolves around what actions we could take that, and will they or will they not cause the United States to take an economic hit. So I think I'll leave it at that, or open it up to our panel members or to the audience, however you want to handle it.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Julie. Really appreciate it. I think what we'll do is we'll open it to the audience for some questions, and then our panelists can react to your comments as well. So why don't we start over here with Beth Chalicki. Go Michelle next.
Excellent. Thank you. My name is Beth Chalicki. I'm with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and this panel was particularly near and dear to my heart because I lived for many years in Alex's end of the country, and now I live in Stacy and Henrik's end of the country. Stacy, you mentioned Mitt Romney. There's no doubt about it that he pulled out of Reggie because he was burnishing his political credentials for his presidential run, his upcoming presidential run. Massachusetts is, of course, traditionally a Democratic state, and now it has a Republican governor, and he's looking for outside state support for his run. He pulled out of Reggie because he assumed his base wouldn't support this. And I think, given that Massachusetts has one of the greenest publics of any state in the nation, it's rather telling that he made this assumption. But the effects of climate change, as any scientist will tell you, are not gerrymandered by political district. So my question for all of the panelists, and Jeff too, if you want to chime in on this, is this. How on earth do we divorce the idea of climate change action from partisan politics? How do we take that partisan stink off of doing something about climate change, whether it's big or little, whether it's regional or national? Why does it have a political label attached to it, and how do we get rid of that?
Beth, could you just hand it right up the...
I'll take a stab initially, if you don't mind. I actually think we're getting there. I mean, as we head into the 2008 presidential election, from where we sit down here, many of the candidates are running to at least say something about climate change, which is a dramatic change from where we've been, to the fact that they even feel like they need to, whether it's real or not, what they're proposing, I mean, at least they're having to speak to the issue. I mean, Senator Hagel has a bill that actually got passed in the last Energy Policy Act last summer. Obviously, McCain. Most of the Democrats are having it in their portfolio of issues they're talking about. And so Again, I don't know. I look at it from the lens of everything that's going on here. So tiny baby steps are helpful, but I think it's not totally a partisan issue at the moment.
So if I could go next. In California, it's not quite a partisan issue. It is
No,
a
it's more than
little.
you know.
Well, but in the legislature, the Democratic legislators tend to support climate action, and the Republican legislators tend not to. Not entirely one-to-one, but not so. However, I think the answer to your question is pretty straightforward. That is, the concerns that conservatives traditionally have towards the economy, towards competitiveness, have to be taken seriously, and the concerns for the supply of energy have to be taken seriously. So I would disagree with a former panelist up here earlier who said that climate change is the largest issue we face. I am an energy guy. I think climate change is issue number 2 in the energy sector, and issue number 1, by the way, is the supply of affordable, reliable, modern energy to the 2 or 3 billion people that don't have it. That's issue number 1 in the energy sector. And then there's a whole other sets of sectors: peace, disease, those sorts of things. And so thinking of this as a single problem, the energy and climate problem, or the energy and carbon problem, if you will, that is and taking all aspects of it seriously and doing good analysis so that we have good answers to some of these tough questions that are getting asked. I think that's how we do it. And showing, flexibility in terms of being sure that we do protect the economy while we protect the environment. I think that is the most important thing.
Michelle?
Yeah. Go on.
Oh, Stacy, I'll let you say. Why don't you save it? We have
Yeah,
lots
that's
of
fine.
questions, not so much time. I want to make
That's
sure
fine.
everybody gets a chance.
Hi, I'm Michelle Betzel from Colorado State University. And the first thing I wanted to say is that June 9th through 11th, the University of Colorado Natural Resource Law Center is having a conference on a Mountain West climate change initiative. And essentially the purpose is to explore whether there might be some sort of opportunities in the Mountain West region. And I'm moderating kind of the final panel, which we try to come up with something, so I will draw on what we discuss here and if you have any suggestions. But one of the things that I noticed as I was looking at the program is they're bringing in some of the folks from RGGI, from the Northeast in particular. I'm not sure. I think there is someone from California as well. And so that points to the issue of the importance of networks, of kind of people talking cross-regionally. And I'm just curious to what extent there are these networks linking the two leading regions of, in particular, California and the Northeast, and kind of can you identify some people and what are the mechanisms through which those networks develop?
Yeah, I think the network exists. They are largely informal, certainly at and also fairly well connected at the technical level. So that, for example, as the regional rules in New England have developed on on building a registry and what to register and how to run one, there are constant sort of papers and discussions produced about how well what they're talking about in New England would fit with what they do in Wisconsin, what they do in California. To the extent to which that information flows back and forth, my impression from New England is that there's a lot of it. As California has accelerated, has sort of pedaled to the metal in the last 24 months, the notion of sort of collaborating on the actual policy content, I think, has been a little less there. Although the thing I hear all the time, we hear several times in New England, is that the Northeast states are saying essentially that if they've all said that if California's vehicle emission standards survive, they'll mostly be enacted in the Northeast. And they've said that they spend a fair bit of time in California at various kinds of different groups talking about how RGGI is supposed to work. And they feel like California is paying a lot of attention, if not in an explicit fashion, but as a policy experiment. The last thing I would mention is that the RGGI, I thought in the last few months, the people in the Greenhouse Gas Initiative have been saying more in public that there is no reason in a cap-and-trade scheme that one needs to be regionally sort of neighbors. So if Maryland, if they have most of the states between Maryland and Maine, save Pennsylvania, which is a coal state and more problematic in some respects, they're saying, if Wisconsin wants to join and negotiate a cap and its firms want to trade, and anybody can join the market. So they feel like it's a matter of negotiating the details, not that it's in principle or in theory at all difficult.
One quick comment. Yes, as far as I know, both lawmakers and the policy wonks, staff people are paying attention to what's happening in New England. My understanding is that some of the lawmakers actually went to some RGGI meetings to try and see what was happening for themselves. Pretty pretty, for myopic Californians, pretty impressive thing to do, actually.
And also, I would add too that like some interesting informal networks. Like there were lots of groups of state legislatures who met at the Kyoto meetings in Canada last. So that there was a state legislators group, and they did their own track, and they met 3 or 4 times over the course of the 2 weeks in the morning, and they were people from legislatures from all of the usual suspects among the U.S. states, but then actually from legislatures from much of the rest of the country that don't always spring to mind when you think of climate action. So
there is also seems to be a growing number of Europeans running all over New England and talking to state officials.
That's true.
And Reggie and California. And there seems to be a growing stream of officials from New England, I'm sure California too, that is traveling to Brussels and other parts in Europe.
Great trips to Northern Europe. Actually.
Yes, so there is nothing formal between the EU and any of the states, but by golly, they are definitely talking to each other.
Right, as long as they don't play golf in Scotland, right? So why don't we take a couple questions. So panelists, please hold off. I know we jump right in and just kind of work around there. Allison, if you could do that, and we'll work down the road after this, Peter, and then the gentleman on the side, and then up to David.
Picking up on a comment that Alexander made, and coming at it from the energy policy point of view, it seems to me that the number one political issue to do with energy in the US at the moment is energy security. So my question to the panel is, to what extent do you think that the climate change world can get on the coattails of the energy security world and try to push for really rigorous energy cutbacks, because the alternative is going to be a move to more and more use of dirty energy. And I'd be interested in the panel's comments.
Yeah, great. If you could pass it over to Peter. Let's say dirty energy, or we haven't heard much about the nuclear option, but certainly hearing your accent and hearing Blair's comments yesterday, right? I mean, it's kind of full ahead in the UK, right? Okay, so Peter.
Just had a quick question for Alexander in regards population growth. I'm wondering if the models that have been put forth in California are assuming some sort of population growth, which is obviously going to occur. And there is, as you might know, a lot of discussion within the climate change policy community that it's really per capita emissions that we should be looking at instead of overall emissions. But it would seem to me that in a state like California, where population growth is, A, such a big political issue, but B, such an obvious fact, that has to be part of the policy thinking. And I'm wondering if it is, or if it's too inconvenient to deal with.
Okay, Peter, if you could hand it to the gentleman on the whiteboard there. Yeah, thank you.
I'll do Andrew Lisi with the World Resources Institute. I'll just make one quick comment about the energy security comment that was made earlier, which is that energy security interests actually can work towards very, very high greenhouse gas emissions. And so there isn't necessarily a natural synergy between the two, although there can be one that actually meets objectives of both. My question was, in the spirit, and this is to anyone in the room, including folks here from Canada, in the spirit of the intersection between energy and climate policy and the spirit of policy development at the state and provincial level, my question is about electricity restructuring. The question basically is, does anyone think that electricity restructuring is really working well? That the electricity markets can, in fact, be competitive. But sort of an adjunct question to that, I mean, there was an early promise when electricity restructuring was fomenting, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, that restructured competitive electricity markets would actually open the door for clean energy technologies, open the door for innovation in the power sector, which is, of course, the largest emitting GHG sector, that this was sort of the path forward, and that at the same time, electricity restructuring was going to deliver reliable and affordable energy. But the experiences in Alberta, Ontario, a number of U.S. states and regions are maybe, saying the opposite, that maybe this isn't such a good thing for a number of reasons, for consumers and for the environment. So I'd be interested in hearing people sort of prognosticate about what is the future of electricity restructuring, and is it really going to be pro-climate, or can we not really tell if it's going to help the climate or not?
Okay, terrific. One more, and then we'll give you guys a shot at it. If we come up to David up here in the front, Allison. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, David Levy again. I'll also pick up on this issue of electricity restructuring because I think it has something to do with RGGI. I've had some limited engagement with RGGI, and I'm hearing you tell the optimistic tale. It's model building, it's capacity building. I came away with a bit more of a pessimistic take that the policy starts off with a complete disjuncture from this panic about the climate. That you see in scientific circles, that RGGI starts off saying we can't have electricity prices go up more than 4% or so. We can't have carbon prices more than $5, maybe $7 a ton. Totally insignificant prices that aren't going to have any impact. And you saw these very modest goals, 10% by 2019, but with sufficient flexibility on importing credits that essentially the stakeholders are saying, we don't want to have to make any reductions. I mean, it's really sufficient flexibility at the edges. Some of the you've probably seen some of the simulations showing that they're predicting quite significant leakage. If you raise prices a bit in New England, where are we going to get power from? Well, the Midwest. What do they burn there? Coal. So some of the forecasts are actually showing higher carbon emissions or leakage offsetting most of any gains. And coming back to the electricity piece, the prices, we're already paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Our prices have jumped 50% in the last year in Massachusetts. People aren't rioting. There's this concern for competitiveness that I don't quite understand. Business isn't collapsing in New England, and they're saying, for climate, we can only have prices 3 or 4% higher, but in order to bail out the nukes and in order to pursue deregulation, which is really allowing monopoly pricing, because now they phased out the old controlled prices, so now we're into pure monopoly pricing, we can allow prices to jump 50%, and that's politically feasible. So in some sense, these judgments are political judgments about what is a politically feasible rise in the price of electricity, which are completely arbitrary in my view, but be interested to hear some reactions.
All right, I'll start with that one, then you can have the electricity deregulation question. Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting in front of my glass half full or half empty over here, David. I don't think we differ that much about RGGI. I don't think that anybody in the RGGI initiative claims that they're going to have a discernible impact on the climate. I think that the entire inspiration for RGGI is political. That they simply believe that unless people are doing things at the state level in parts of the country to demonstrate that something can be done without, quote, I'll quote the president, wrecking the economy, unquote, right? And so over and over, in some respects, I mean, the scientific consensus, the fact that impacts are measurable, the state officials all run around saying, we know in our state records that we already have impacts. We know what's happening with our coasts. We know what's happening with the weather. But in most of that is justification for the fact that they believe that they have to do something to put pressure on the federal government to do something in the future. And I don't think I think you're exactly right about the extreme modesty of the initiative. The modesty of the initiative, as far as I can tell from the staff who work on it, is not just this notion that electricity prices can't be driven up. I feel like the biggest pressure for them to be modest is they don't want it to fail. Because they believe the demonstration effects are so important, they don't want to try anything that might fail. And so there's a real reluctance, even in the very strongly pro sort of environment, climate change policymakers in the group, to push for anything that might actually result in failure and therefore be used against any future justification for action.
And many of them are saying, in an ideal world, RGGI won't even be around in 2019. We'll have a federal system. Right? So I think that's also, yes, they are planning all the way up to 2019, but I would say that the vast majority of people working on it don't think that RGGI will be around in 2019. They think that we'll have a federal system, which they have hopefully influenced politically by the way that they have shaped RGGI.
In regard to the question on population growth, California does face very rapid population growth. These numbers assume that rapid population growth. The per capita emission discussion is not part of the discussion as far as I know. One reason possibly for that is if one begins to talk about that, then quickly that becomes a discussion about the large populations in the South and in developing countries that have neither energy nor anthropogenic CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a very different discussion, a very difficult one, and I think most people who are policymakers don't want to go there. Regarding the question on electricity restructuring and the question also on energy security, I think the answer the answers to those questions are rather similar. Is they need not be connected, and there's no reason to think that they are connected. So electricity restructuring was oversold by a lot of people. I don't know if any of you ever had the chance, you can see the movie about Enron, if you've ever had the chance to be in the room with people from Enron browbeating state officials that we are the future. If you don't do what we're going to do, we're going to get you thrown out of office, and you're going to do your state citizens harm. It was really amazing. But they weren't the only ones. And the idea that innovation is a possibility in a market system is certainly correct. However, these electric power systems or electric power markets they do have a couple of features that don't exist in others. This transmission system, we still don't know how to get investment in transmission system very well. We're beginning to learn some of these things. The markets work much better now than they did when they were first introduced, both in the Northeast and in California. Will they solve all the problems that we might think of without other regulation? In my view, no. But they do work much better than they did at first. There is in California a term called clean tech. Clean tech is technology for clean energy. The view is held by some people that this is the next step for Silicon Valley. The venture capital folks on Sam Hill Road, Kleiner Perkins, and those sorts of folks get up in public meetings and tell public officials, state officials, give us a signal that this is going to be something that's required, that either a carbon tax, as has been indicated perhaps for Canada, or a carbon cap is going to be required, and you will see the unleashing of technology and nanotechnology for clean energy, both in end-use technology and in generation technology, maybe even in transmission. Whether this is true or simply another bubble that's beginning to form, I don't know, but there is a lot of interest in that. Regarding the energy security issue, you may well be right that energy security is issue number one for right now. It tends to come and go. It tends to get a lot of lip service. There's lots of studies that have suggested a number of sensible things to do, a number of unsensible things to do, pretty much none of which have been adopted in any sort of systematic fashion. I am personally concerned that we might end up going the other way. What happened when Katrina struck? Well, what happened to the refinery rules for air quality? Rightly, the government suspended them. That was the right thing to do to restore that capacity to service. They've since come back, the air quality rules. But if we had a real problem in the petroleum supply, that's really what energy security means for most people, is petroleum supply. If we really had a problem in petroleum supply, my concern would be that environmental and other concerns besides environmental would go out the window, maybe right or wrong. I'd have to know the details to make a judgment about that, and that could be very problematic. And the question of leakage and what people are willing to take. I think what Stacy said is quite right. We worry about leakage. That's part of the constitutionality question. There is a great deal of disagreement about what the cost of any of these policies are going to be. I'm engaged in that debate right now. I should have said that in my presentation. I participated in some parts of what I was describing, sort of an unwitting participant observant. And one of the real issues is that many of the models that have predicted the destruction of an economy are unable to model anything else. They are incapable of producing any other result. One reason for this essentially is they have no bottom of the tail for endogenous technological change. For those of you who don't understand, talk to me later, I'll explain what that means. But there is an active debate. One of the interesting, and I'll stop there for a little bit.
I'll just add one more positive note on the energy security point, which is that politically, it has the possibility of being helpful. I mean, we are having a debate about raising fuel economy standards that we have not had for years and years and years, and we may get some small little things done that might actually help reduce our emissions. Maybe we'll extend our tax credits for hybrid vehicles, and I mean, so there are some positive policy solutions that follow the energy security debate that could help on climate, but there are plenty of risks as well.
I would just add on the per capita emissions that John Holdren, we were just looking at this graph, Henrik and I this morning, that John Holdren from the Kennedy School is sporting a graph that plots the per capita energy use and per capita emissions in red states and blue states around the country, and finds, much to his satisfaction, that the blue states are all clustered as the most energy efficient, and therefore are now called the most conservative with regard to energy use.
Okay. I'm afraid we've come to the end of the time allotted for this panel. I know there are more questions. Hopefully we can pick them up in the next panel and in tomorrow's discussions as well. So we will reconvene at 4:15, which is not too many minutes from now, and for our final panel. And I want you all to join me in thanking these folks for
Right, I didn't write it, but yeah, that'll probably be in how much of that I actually want to see in print, because it's still live.
Who's first?
Yeah, let's do it. So there's someone to report back.